It's now time to prepare to pour the epoxy. So I've come inside the house because we need as much of a dust-free environment as possible. And I live on a hill and it's very windy out there today, so that definitely isn't going to work. So I'm inside the house. I'm going to also put a cover over the top of this after the epoxy is poured to try to keep as much dust from getting on the top of the epoxy as it cures. We've got our pieces here and they're elevated up above by that piece of wood we put underneath. And all of them are now level. You need to make sure they're level in every direction. Measure in many parts on your piece, because if they're not level, the epoxy is just going to pour off one side and you're not going to like the result. So now I'm going to show you how I prepare to measure out the epoxy. First thing you need to do is measure this, how many inches long and wide, and put it in the calculator. The calculator is linked in the video description, and that will tell you how much epoxy you need to mix up. So let's go mix up some epoxy. I've decided to do the map section first, and then I'll do the two end pieces later. So for that, I need 24 ounces of hardener and 24 ounces of resin. So to measure that out, we're going to measure 24 ounces of water and pour that into a container. The calculator said that I needed 46 ounces. So I upped that to 48 just to be sure. Now originally I was going to do this in one pour, but I decided to do it in two pours just to be sure, because you don't have a second chance. So it's very important to get it right the first time. So I poured it into this $1 container used to store dog food, $1.25 store. And I'm drawing a black line around that, which you can see both of my black lines now. I'm using the lower one. And now I'm going to pour this into this container, which I just repurposed a chocolate almond container from Costco. If you've never had these, they're very, very good. And if you've had them, put them in the freezer. They're even better frozen. And I'm marking that, so I'm going to put the resin in one container and the hardener in the other, and then put the two together. So I'm going to pour the epoxy resin right up to the line, and you can see it's nice and thick. And you don't want to go past that line. I'll let that level out for a moment. Just a little bit more. And I think we are there. Notice I covered the kitchen counter with a sheet of cardboard. There's no going back if you spill this. So that was the resin. And this is going to be the hardener up to that line. The hardener is much thinner. You'll see that when it pours. Very easy to pour. You're going to get right up to that line. It's a 1-to-1 ratio. Okay, now I don't need those containers anymore. I'm going to deal with these two, and now I got to go get some gloves on and get the mixer. We've got our resin, and we've got our hardener, and we've got a drill to mix it with. There are instructions that you can download and print online to tell you how to do this step by step. It tells you specifically, don't use a drill to mix it. But I've done this before, as long as you run the drill at a slow enough speed as if you were mixing it by hand, you'll be okay. I mixed this by hand before, and it takes a long time and it's tiring. You have to mix it continuously for 5 to 8 minutes. So I set my countdown timer on my phone, and I'm going to start mixing these. Got to be sure to get all of the hardener out of the container. Every ounce matters. Whatever containers you use to mix this, make sure they're disposable. You will never use them again. When you're mixing this, you may see some bubbles form, but that's okay. We will get those bubbles out after it's poured. It's important to have a flat bottom container so that you can get everything mixed and there's no cracks or crevices. Of course, what happens while I was mixing, the battery died in the camera. So we've got this all mixed up. Actually, I got to get a piece of cardboard to place that on. So one of the great things about Amazon is they give us lots of boxes and cardboard. You'll notice that there are quite a few bubbles in that mixture, and that's okay. They worry about that online quite a bit, but I've discovered it's not as big of a problem as it's made out to be. Okay, so now we're going to pour it. So it's pretty simple. You just pour. And you can tell that this is the reason. You got to make sure that this is very level. And you can use a dollar store spatula here to help smooth it out a little bit and get it to flow. And once it's got that path, there'll be so little resistance, it'll continue to flow over the edges. And it will self-level. Now, I can't tell if you can see in the camera. There are lots of bubbles. I'm going over the edge and smoothing it out. I'll also show you later what I did with tape on the bottom so that we don't get lots of excess epoxy on the bottom and make it easier to finish when this is over with. I forgot to show you that earlier, so stay tuned. Now there's lots of bubbles and maybe an impurity here. Nope, that was a bubble. So there's lots of bubbles. The way to get rid of the bubbles is using a torch. You're going to use a propane torch to get the bubbles out. And as you go over about 6 to 8 inches above with the propane torch, you'll be able to see the bubbles pop. Don't want to do too close. If you do, you could burn the epoxy. I know that from experience. When I was doing an experimental piece, when I first started doing epoxy, I burned the experimental piece. That's why you always got to experiment first. Got to keep the propane moving to be sure that you don't burn it. And you're going to see a beautiful glass finish starting to appear. Now, if this wasn't sealed with the Mod Podge, then you'd have a lot more bubbles. And it'd be a lot more difficult. I believe the instructions said that you could do this for up to 40 minutes. After 40 minutes, it'll be hard enough that you'd end up burning the epoxy. And it's important to kind of get down at an angle to be able to see where the bubbles are. I find that when the propane tank starts to empty, it'll just flame out like that. So then I go to this little butane torch. This is really important. You want to spend time doing this very carefully, but if you don't do this, later you'll be upset because you'll see some bubbles. So you got to be really careful you don't bounce into it. Boy, it looks really good. I like what I see so far. I'm going to let this sit for about 5 minutes, and then I'm going to go back at it with the torch, and I'm not going to have you watch all that. So in the next scene, probably see me covering it up and a few notes. So if you're going to do this, you'll get positive results like this. This is the 4th one that I've done so far. And each time I learn a little something new. The last thing you do before you let it rest, I would go along the bottom with the spatula. Just take off the remaining drips. If you do have drips here, if I show you what I did with the tape, it won't be much of a problem. So let me show you how to eliminate drips being a problem. On your pieces, you've put that board and you use the painter's tape and super glue to put this board on. You should also go all the way around the edge with the painter's tape. That will save you a lot of work in the future, because when you pour this and it pours over the edge, it's going to leave a drip. No matter what you do, there's going to be a drip. Normally, when it hardens, you would have to sand and smooth that drip down. But if you put this tape on, you'll be able to peel it off and basically bend the drips right off, and it'll save you a lot of time sanding. You'll still have to sand a little bit, but it's very, very little compared to if you had to sand those drips off. Because when this epoxy hardens, it's really hard and it's tough stuff. So, just another hint. Now I put those 3 pieces down, because I want to put this foam board over the top. It's an old piece of foam board, and I've cleaned one side really well to make sure there was no dust on it. And that is going to gently just go over the top. Be sure to have something to cover up your epoxy projects while the resin is curing. It'll take a day for it to get hard enough that dust and particles don't hurt it. It takes 72 hours to fully cure.